The moment he stepped forward, the atmosphere in the room shifted. There was an unshakable confidence in his posture, a presence that commanded attention without a single word being spoken. The murmurs among the crowd quieted as all eyes turned toward him. He wasn't there for small talk, he wasn't there for pleasantries. He was there for answers, and he was going to get them. For too long, the air had been thick with accusations, misleading narratives, and grandstanding that prioritized noise over truth. He had watched it unfold from a distance, letting the theatrics play out, but now, face to face, it was time to set the record straight. The one standing across from him had reveled in the safety of echo chambers, surrounded by applause from those who never questioned the script they had been fed, but that safety net was about to be ripped away. His voice was steady, deliberate. Every word was chosen carefully, not to provoke, but to reveal. To expose the contradictions, the double standards, the sheer lack of accountability that had been allowed to fester unchecked. He began with a simple question, one that required no elaborate defense, no spin, just an honest answer. Yet, even that proved too difficult. Instead of a response, he was met with deflection, with frustration thinly veiled beneath performative indignation. The weight of the moment was undeniable. The carefully crafted image of authority, once unwavering in its conviction, began to falter. A nervous glance to the side, a sharp inhale, the unmistakable flicker of unease in the eyes. These were the tells of someone unprepared for a confrontation that didn't follow the usual script. The rules had changed. The comfortable stage, where applause was guaranteed regardless of substance, had been replaced by an arena where only truth would stand unchallenged. He pressed forward, not with aggression, but with precision. Each statement was backed by facts, not rhetoric. Each question was rooted in reality, not conjecture. The response? A desperate attempt to regain control through volume rather than reason. The louder the outburst, the clearer it became that there were no solid answers to be given. It was an unraveling in real time, a struggle to maintain composure in the face of undeniable reality. The crowd, once passive spectators, leaned in. Some exchanged glances, recognizing the shift taking place before them. Others watched in stunned silence as the unraveling continued. This was no longer a performance. This was exposure. What had begun as an attempt to assert dominance had now flipped entirely. Every attempt to dismiss, to brush aside, only served to highlight the glaring gaps in credibility. With every evasion came another layer of doubt, not cast by accusations, but by the inability to refute what was being presented. The frustration turned to visible anger, but anger could not mask the truth. And he knew it. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to resort to theatrics. The facts spoke for themselves, and for the first time, perhaps ever, the one standing across from him had no escape. She had always thrived in the spotlight, commanding attention with her sharp tongue and unwavering confidence. When she walked into the room, there was an air of self-assurance, a certainty that she would once again be in control of the conversation. She had handled countless debates, spoken on major platforms, and knew exactly how to spin a situation to her advantage. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just another scripted exchange where she could dictate the narrative, with rehearsed lines and predictable responses. There was an intensity in the air, an expectation that hadn't been there before. The usual tactics, deflect, dismiss, dominate, suddenly felt insufficient. At first, she played it the way she always did, with a confident smirk and a dismissive tone. Her words carried the same sharpness, but there was something off about the delivery. It wasn't landing the way it usually did. The audience wasn't reacting with the same immediate support. The nods of agreement weren't as automatic. She could feel it. The first real moment of discomfort came when she was asked a direct question, one that cut through the noise and demanded an answer that wasn't wrapped in deflection. There was a pause, small but noticeable. She knew she had to respond quickly, so she leaned into what she knew best. Shifting the focus. A laugh, a roll of the eyes, a quick attempt to turn the question into a joke at someone else's expense. Usually this would work, Usually the audience would eat it up, but this time there was no laughter. There was no applause. Just silence. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, but it was enough to shake her confidence. The question came. Again, this time with more weight. There was no escaping it. She had to answer. She started speaking, but something was off. The usual rhythm wasn't there. The sharpness that usually carried her words with authority felt dulled. She could hear her own voice, and for the first time in a long time, it wavered just slightly. It was barely noticeable, but she felt it. And if she felt it, that meant others did too. She doubled down, attempting to regain control. More words, spoken faster, spoken louder. If she couldn't win with substance, she could at least dominate with volume. That had worked before. A passionate outburst, a forceful condemnation of those who dared to question her position. She had built her reputation on being unshakable, on taking down anyone who stood in her way with a verbal onslaught that left them speechless. But this wasn't working. The person in front of her wasn't reacting the way she expected. They weren't getting flustered, they weren't backing down. They weren't giving her the reaction she needed to flip the script back in her favor. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was talking in circles. The audience could see it, and now she could too. She felt the heat rising, the tension building. Her breathing quickened, though she tried to control it. She could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, and for a brief moment, she realized she was no longer in control. She reached for another tactic, playing the victim. If she could frame the situation as an unfair attack, maybe she could shift the sympathy in her direction. She raised her voice, her tone taking on a sharper edge, filled with exasperation. She accused, she pointed fingers, she demanded respect. But that too fell flat. The audience wasn't buying it. They weren't rallying behind her as they had before. Instead, they were watching, observing, taking in the spectacle of someone who was unraveling before their eyes. Her frustration turned into anger. It was no longer about winning the argument, it was about survival. She had to claw her way back. Into dominance, had to reassert herself before the damage became irreversible. She leaned forward, her gestures more erratic now. Her words lost their carefully crafted structure, spilling out in rapid succession, one after another, as if the sheer force of speaking would erase the doubts that were now creeping into the minds of those watching. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was struggling. The carefully curated image of confidence and control was cracking. The sharp wit that had carried her through so many past encounters was failing her. Her voice, once a weapon, now betrayed her. She could see the looks on the faces in the audience. Some were surprised, others were amused, but the worst ones were those who looked at her with pity. She could handle anger, she could handle opposition, but pity? That was unbearable. Her hands clenched, her breathing uneven. She tried to regain her composure, but the damage had been done. The moment had slipped away from her. The very thing she had built her reputation on, her ability to command any situation, was now crumbling in real time. The moment was supposed to be routine. Another exchange, another opportunity to reinforce a well-established narrative. The cameras were rolling, the audience was watching, and everything seemed to be unfolding as expected. But then, something shifted. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation in tone, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The usual rhythm of confident speech, the familiar cadence that dictated control of the room, suddenly felt off. The words were still coming, but they weren't landing with the same force. Instead of unwavering agreement from the audience, there was something else. Curiosity, skepticism, an energy that suggested people were truly listening, perhaps for the first time in a long time. The exchange continued, and the tension in the air thickened. Every carefully prepared response, every attempt to steer the conversation in a familiar direction was met with resistance. Not outright rejection, not hostility, just resistance. And that was more dangerous than anything else. For so long, control had been effortless. Words had carried weight simply because they were spoken with authority. Statements had been accepted without challenge, assertions met with nods of approval rather than scrutiny. But now the dynamic had changed. The eyes in the room weren't just looking, they were studying. The silence wasn't passive, it was expectant. It was the silence of people waiting for something real, something substantial, something more than just a well-rehearsed act. The first real crack appeared when a point was made that couldn't be easily dismissed. The usual tactics, laughter, ridicule, redirection, weren't working. A single moment of pause became too long, turning into an opening that hadn't been accounted for. It was met not with more silence, but with whispers, murmurs, the sound of an audience processing what they were seeing. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew. It spread across the room, an invisible shift in perception that couldn't be undone. The more words spilled out in response, the more it became clear that they weren't sticking. Instead of regaining control, the desperate attempt to reassert authority only made the unraveling more obvious. The once commanding presence in the room was now faltering. What had started as an attempt to dictate the conversation had turned into a battle to keep from losing it entirely. Eyes that once reflected, agreement now carried doubt. Expressions that once held admiration now showed curiosity, even skepticism. There was an undeniable struggle taking place, not one of facts or opinions, but of perception. The audience wasn't just listening to what was being said, they were watching how it was being said. They were seeing the small hesitations, the forced confidence, the way frustration was beginning to edge into the voice that once spoke with certainty. A desperate pivot was attempted, a last-ditch effort to reclaim the moment. More forceful, words, a sharper tone, an appeal to emotion rather than logic. But the shift had already happened. The room was no longer responding the way it once had. The murmurs had turned into quiet conversations, subtle but unmistakable. The people who had once been passive spectators were now participants in something bigger. They weren't just absorbing information, they were analyzing it. They were thinking for themselves. And that was the real loss. Not the debate, not the argument, but the illusion of control. The realization that words alone were no longer enough to dictate reality. That people had begun to see through the act, to recognize the difference between authority and authenticity. No outburst, no impassioned plea, no dramatic display of indignation could change what had already happened. The moment had slipped away. The power that had once been absolute was now fractured, leaving only the echo of what used to be. The room had fallen into a heavy silence, the kind that only happens when something unexpected takes place. It was as if the entire atmosphere had shifted in a single moment, leaving everyone caught between shock and fascination. Everything had been building up to this, though no one had realized it at first. What had started as a routine exchange had gradually turned into something more tense, more revealing. The air had grown thick with unspoken questions, with challenges that hadn't been anticipated. Then, it happened. A final statement, delivered with a calmness that cut through the chaos like a blade. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried more weight than anything that had come before it. There was no immediate response, no quick rebuttal, no attempt to redirect the conversation. Instead, there was just a frozen moment where everything seemed to slow down. The words hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. The reaction was visible almost instantly. A slight stiffening of posture, a rapid blinking as if trying to process what had just been said. The carefully maintained composure that had been upheld. Throughout the conversation wavered, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The audience saw it. The hesitation, the momentary lapse in confidence. It was the first real sign that the control over the situation had been lost. A breath was taken, a quick attempt to regain footing, but it was already too late. The room had shifted. The power, dynamic had changed, and there was no undoing it. There was an attempt to push back, to recover, but the response felt hollow. The usual confidence was gone, replaced with something more defensive, more reactionary. It was no longer about making a point. It was about damage control. The people in the room could sense it. They weren't just hearing words anymore. They were reading between the lines, noticing every subtle sign of discomfort, every small detail that indicated something had cracked beneath the surface. The energy was no longer the same. The ones who had once been so sure, so unwavering in their stance were now second-guessing. There was a quiet realization spreading, an understanding that something fundamental had changed. The more words were spoken in response, the weaker they seemed. Not because they lacked volume, but because they lacked conviction. The attempt to fight back only made the loss of control more obvious. There was a growing awareness in the room that this wasn't just about the immediate conversation anymore. It was about something much bigger, about perception, about truth, about the ability to hold one's ground when faced with undeniable reality. For those watching, it was a rare moment of clarity. The usual distractions, the usual tactics, had all fallen away. What was left was something raw, something that couldn't be ignored. No one needed to say anything. The silence spoke louder than any words could. The silence stretched on, heavier than any words that could have followed. It wasn't the silence of agreement or approval. It was the silence of realization. The kind that settled deep, making people question everything they had just witnessed. There had been an undeniable shift, one that couldn't be undone with a clever remark or an attempt to move the conversation forward. The moment had passed, and in its wake only one truth remained: control had been lost. There was an attempt to regain composure, a forced smile, a subtle straightening of posture, but the damage had already been done. The audience had seen it, the hesitation, the crack in confidence, the desperate search for a response that never came. There was no coming back from it. Once an illusion was shattered, it could never be rebuilt in the same way. Expressions in the crowd ranged from amusement to astonishment, from quiet satisfaction to disbelief. Some exchanged knowing glances, as if silently acknowledging that they had just witnessed something significant. Others remained still, processing what had just unfolded. No one spoke immediately because there was nothing left to say. For the one who had dominated the conversation until now, the weight of the moment was undeniable. The realization that authority had slipped away, that the usual tactics had failed, settled in like an unwelcome truth. Every instinct screamed to keep fighting, to regain control, to refuse to acknowledge what had just happened. But deep down, there was no denying it. The final words had not just ended the conversation, they had sealed it. The audience, the cameras, the entire environment had captured a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. A moment that couldn't be rewritten, reframed, or manipulated to fit a different narrative. With no other options left, the only choice was to move on, to pretend as if nothing had changed. But it had.